Hi everyone, my name is Siamak Paulson and this is my geosynthetics podcast. So welcome to this episode, and as you can see I have a special guest, Chris Lawson. He has joined me today this morning. I think it should be around mid-morning your time in Kuala Lumpur, Chris.
Uh,
It's
we're,
around midday my time.
we're behind you, so it's early morning
Yeah,
here.
perfect, perfect. No, thanks for accepting my invitation, Chris. I'm pretty sure this episode is going to be very interesting. You have a wealth of knowledge about the industry, the geosynthetics, and you've spent majority of your career outside of Australia, your home country. So we will be talking about a lot of those topics today. But let's just start with your a brief about your career, Chris. Your education, where did you start working, and then how did you end up in geosynthetics?
Okay, thanks, Mick. I did my postgraduate degree in geosynthetics in the mid-1970s.
Okay.
And of course, back then, these materials weren't known as geosynthetics. They're called all sorts of different names, filter fabrics, etc. So I did that at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Then after I completed that, I worked for several years in Australia and Southeast Asia in geosynthetics. And of course, they're all very, very new then, and nobody knew anything about the subject. Then in the mid-1980s, I moved to the UK, where I worked in the UK and Europe in the area of geosynthetics. And I found that most interesting. And then in the mid-1990s, I moved back here to Southeast Asia, here in Malaysia, running an Asia Pacific operation. And that's what I've done until today. And I retired about a year ago. So I joined the retired ranks, and I get to do what I want to do now. So in a nutshell, that's time-wise, that's basically what I've covered.
Okay. No, great. That's great. Um, so my first question would be, with like all of those years of experience that you have, Chris, um, especially in our industry, in geosynthetics industry, um, what do you think has changed since you started and until now? Where is the industry going? How do you look at it?
I think the industry has changed a lot over the years. Back in say the 1970s and early 1980s, the industry was basically funded by large industrial companies who had deep pockets,
Mm.
and they had plenty of money. And they had plenty of money, they could keep the industry moving along at times when it might not have succeeded. And so they had a very long-term view about things, and so they kept it going. And then when you come into the 1980s, there was a lot of changes in the 1980s. New design methods were being developed, which incorporated geosynthetics. A lot of good research work was done on geosynthetics, on the products and how they were being used. So the 1980s were a very interesting decade. And if I look back in my history, I think I would say the 1980s were the most interesting times of all. Then came the 1990s, and what you found in the 1990s is there was a change in power, if you like, from the consultant who designed the job to the contractor who built it.
Mhm.
In the 1990s, the power shift moved to the contractor, and that changed a lot in how geosynthetics were viewed, how they were used, how they were valued, all these
Mhm.
things. So the industry had to change to adapt to that. And then getting into the 2000s, a lot of regulations came to be developed in geosynthetics. A lot of design codes were written specifically on geosynthetics. And that's the end result situation which we have today. So over the years, things have changed a lot. Uh, and I think the companies who stayed with that and been successful are the ones that have adapted to those changes over the years. Yeah.
Yeah, correct, correct. So the other question I had, Chris, is about so your years of work in the manufacturing. disciplines. So how did you find it, and what do you think was different in with any other things that you've done in your career, like other than manufacturing?
Well, I found that manufacturing new to me because my background is not in manufacturing; it's in technical part of marketing and geosynthetics. But I did find it very interesting. The manufacturing part is capital intensive; it's money intensive. So you need money to do it, and you need to make the right decisions. Because if you make the wrong decisions, you've lost a lot of money, and your company will come down on your head as a result of that. So, but it's a matter of having faith and trust, I think, in your knowledge and your understanding, and that propels and drives it forward. So, I think later on in my life, I wasn't concerned about the possibilities of spending relatively large amounts of money because I had the confidence that it would be successful in several years to come. And I think with manufacturing, you need to look at things in a medium sort of time frame. You can't look at being an immediate success, because if you look at immediate success, then you're probably going to fail. So you need to have this medium-term view of things, and once you have that and you've convinced others around you to think like that too, then I think you can be successful. But you also need to have the marketing with the manufacturing. You can't do one without the other. So it's a matter of having them both.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And you mentioned about your technical roles as well, and I wanted to ask about the maybe education part, and because I've seen you many times, in Australia and other places, providing short courses and training courses. How important do you think these trainings are, and are we sort of doing it well now with all the technology that we have access to?
I think if I look back at my earlier days, there was never a real forum available to be able to talk about geosynthetics knowledge, if you like, and that only came about probably during the 1980s when more interest was shown in geosynthetics. And the way of doing that was to do short courses, seminars, and things like this, because at universities the subject was not taught at all, and there appeared to be no interest in teaching it, I have to say, at that time. So the only way to get the message across was to pick up your bag, if you like, and go out on the road and do talks and seminars in different places around the place. And just to give you an idea, back in my early days, in the late 70s in Southeast Asia, I'd be away on the road for 8 or 10 weeks at a time. Back then I was single and not married, of course. So, and every day you were giving a talk to a different company or a different place and different thing. And I think it was like being like a pop star showman, picking up your bags and going from place to place. But that's how the message was getting across in those days. These days, with technology like video conferencing and webinars and all this sort of thing, you can capture a much wider audience much more easier than you could in the past. And I think technology has helped a lot over the past 5 or 10 years. And I think probably in the next 5 or 10 years, we'll see that change again for the better. But, in the early days, it was, a lot of foot thumping and along the road and all that sort of thing to try and get the message across. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And you mentioned Southeast Asia, so that's my next question, Chris. You spent a lot of years in there, and you basically know almost everyone and everything in that market. What is your opinion, or how do you summarize all of those years of experience? How do you see the market in Southeast Asia compared to other places that you've worked in?
Yeah. Southeast Asia is a very interesting place, and it's an interesting place from the point of view of geosynthetics, and it's an interesting place from the point of view of culture. While the countries in Southeast Asia are very close together, no two countries are the same. They're all quite different. And if you treat them all the same, then you're going to run into trouble. So they're all quite different. The other big positive about Southeast Asia, it has the climate and the ground conditions that are particularly helpful for geosynthetics. For example, there are a lot of soft soils and marine clays and all this, and plus also there's also big investments in infrastructure in Southeast Asia. So the application and the use for geosynthetics is quite good and quite high, and it's always been like that.
Yeah.
And while it took several years to start off, geosynthetics are used a lot here in Southeast Asia because of those conditions which fit geosynthetics.
Yeah. And which kind of sectors of the industry do you see being sort of more advanced in terms of their knowledge of geosynthetics, the application of geosynthetics, and also in terms of the volume of the market or the size of the market?
Yeah, I think the biggest use of geosynthetics here in Southeast Asia are in reclamation works.
Yeah.
That's because of the coastline. And a lot of the big developments follow the coastline here in Southeast Asia. The second biggest use for geosynthetics is probably as reinforced fills. And that's because of the infrastructure investment and the types of foundations they have here in Southeast Asia. A lot of highways are built over soft clays and things like this, which consume a lot of geosynthetics. A lot of PVDs are consumed there. And so it's really those two areas which are probably the biggest consumers of geosynthetics. Behind that, there's the environmental area. And the environmental area is followed behind. It hasn't had the same prominence as, say, it has in Australia, the same level of importance, because historically people have probably just tried to cut corners on environmental use, but it is catching up. So I put the environmental use probably at number 3 behind those first two. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. And then you mentioned about the differences, like, between the countries in the whole region, and that's very, very true. I just wanted to wanted you to elaborate on that a little bit more. Like, how do you see, for example, China being different from, let's say India, or like, areas such as like Malaysia, Indonesia, some of the key sort of differences that you've seen in the years that you worked in there?
Well, let me park China to the side to begin with, because it's such a big country and it's really quite different to the rest of Southeast Asia. But come back first to Southeast Asia. You've got to look at how the different countries approach things, and countries such as Singapore adapt to new technologies very quickly. I mean, small country, everybody knows what everybody's doing in Singapore, but they take on new ideas very quickly. And if I remember it, back in the late 1970s, it probably took Singapore about 2 to 3 years only before they were readily using geosynthetics. Now, if you contrast that to, say, a country like Thailand, Thailand is much more conservative in the way they think. And they've got a very rigid structure there, in that the younger ones who adapt probably new ideas quicker than the older ones will not rock the boat, because the older ones are viewed on high to know what to do. And so the younger ones follow that. And so in Thailand, geosynthetics probably took about 8 to 10 years to catch on, not 2 years like Singapore. Now, the other countries like Malaysia probably took 4 or 5 years, Indonesia 4 or 5 years, things like this. So depending on their culture and their way they deal with things, it's taken that period of time. Coming to China, China spent many of the years in the late 70s, early 80s, picking itself up from the Cultural Revolution. And it was backward compared to other countries. But having said that, since the latter part of the 1980s and since the 1990s, China has really moved on leaps and bounds. And what you and I might think of a medium to large project China thinks of that as a small project in the sheer scale of the way they do things.
Yeah.
They will do projects today which take millions of square meters. And you and I might think, wow, especially by Australian standards, that's really big.
Exactly.
But in China, the way they think about it, well, that's just day-to-day stuff. And so the movement and the way things are done in China today, it's really moving on, hand over hand. It really is moving quickly. Different parts of China are doing different things. It's not all like one common denominator because it is such a big country. But there, a lot of what their technology and use is following. It's following a lot of North America, probably more so than Europe. They're more attuned to America than Europe within China, although they have set their own goals, their own drives. So yeah, it's coming along both in how they use the product, their manufacturing, how they make the product has definitely improved a lot over the 10 to 15 years. So a lot of what their manufacturing is today is the same as it's world class. Depending on the same as what it is, say, in North America and Europe. So it's good quality. I mean, it's not all good quality as it is in other countries, but it's definitely moved on a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that last comment about quality, that was actually my question, Chris. Because at least in Australia, we used to see a lot of Chinese products coming maybe 10, 15 years ago, but it sort of dropped to some extent. And I'm not talking about like the volume, it's more percentage wise, like, because industry here in Australia sort of went more towards like, certain qualities or higher standards and things like that, which has slowed down some of that Chinese manufacturing export to Australia. So how do you see that? Or what have you from where you have worked? What do you think about that?
Yeah, 10 or 15 years ago, China made two types of products. There's what you would call the China national products, and these were made to a quality that the companies could sell within China. And there it was all sold on price. So the cheapest price got the business. And of course, to get the cheapest price, you made the lowest quality. And that was the China national products back at that time. Then the second group, what you found, which was much smaller back then, was what you call the China international products. And these are Chinese-made products that are actually marketed internationally to international standards. So they're made to ASTM, for example, in America, European norms in Europe, and things like this. And that started off fairly small back in 10, 15 years ago. But today, it's probably about a 50-50 to China national to international. So the international standard products have improved a lot and gained a lot more traction because the Chinese authorities have realised that this quality is important. Now, these China national products sold on price. And what happens is you're never ever too sure whether you have the cheapest price or somebody else comes along who's cheaper than you.
Yeah.
And so what you found, those companies then started to have problems selling their products in China.
Yeah.
Okay. And so to find more business, they started promoting them outside China. And they started promoting them in Southeast Asia, Australia, and I'm sure you've experienced it. When they turned up, there were loads of quality problems with them. And it was those China national products like that who created all those problems. And of course, once you've had the problem with them, you never use the product again, do you? Right. So what happens? They appeared, and then after a year or so, they disappeared because of that. And it's because of the standard and the way they were made. Now, they were nice, cheap prices because that's what they're made to. But now I think more and more the Chinese products do adhere to these international standards. And it's important when you look at those Chinese products, you do check them opposite what they are to these international standards, because some groups of them are very good quality today. So, but you just have to stay away from the older China national standard products, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. My kind of last question before I ask the final question about your career, Chris, just because I'm really enjoying this conversation. You talked about the education, the trainings, and also like the differences between the countries around our region. And you and I know that Brisbane, Australia, is the host of a big conference next year, which is called GeoAsia 8. And you're part of the advisory committee of that conference too. What do you think will be important to consider for the conference in terms of not necessarily harmonizing the region in terms of the manufacturing, or it's more about like, getting to that sort of a standard that can be applicable in more and more places, like, higher quality and more technical knowledge improvement.
Yeah, I think the big thing for GeoAsia 8 is it has to get across the message that it's going to be for all Asia Pacific people and what their interests are. Now, in Australia, of course, there's big interest in geomembranes and landfills and mining. That's not the biggest interest here in Southeast Asia. Biggest interest here in Southeast Asia are in highway works, coastal works, things like that. There is some interest in environmental works and landfills. There is some interest in mining, where there's very little environmental control over mining here in Southeast Asia. So almost anything goes here in Southeast Asia mining. So I think it's a matter for the conference is that they really have to appear and to demonstrate that they're going to be of interest to all people. And that's going to then want to make them come to it.
Right.
Because if people have no interest, don't think they have an interest, they won't come, they won't turn up. And Brisbane, is an 8 to 10 hour airplane flight away for a lot of them. So it's a significant trip for them. So I think, GeoAsia 8 has to make it interesting, but it also has to keep the interest for the Australians. It can't shut down the Australian interest and just so the Asians might come. So, and when I went to the last Geosynthetics conference in Melbourne in July, I thought the topics covered was really good because it was really suited for Australia. You had big interest in mining, environmental landfills, geomembranes, and the Australians lapped that up, and they really like it. And that, I think, that conference really hit the nail on the head. Yeah, it's very good. Now you've got to turn to adapt for the Asians as well. And that's a different ball game. It's a much more wider scope, much more wider interest. And I think you have to demonstrate that, because if you can demonstrate that, they'll come. They'll actually turn up to it, and you'll have more exhibitions and exhibition spaces and all those sorts of things. Certainly will. So it's a matter of covering both. And both are going to be quite different subject areas. So it's how you manage that's going to be important, I think. So,
yeah, absolutely. No, really, really important point there, Chris. And my final question, back with regards to your career in engineering and geosynthetics, I always ask my guests about their highlight of the career, what that highlight is and why is that your highlight?
I said it before, I think I found the best period of time, or most interesting period of time overall, was the 1980s.
Yeah.
And there are several reasons for that, because a number of things went on in the 1980s. And first of all, the area of geosynthetics had changed from being something novel and new, like plastic cars and things like this, to an engineering material. And design methods were being developed in the 1980s, although they're pretty simple sorts of methods by today's standards, for how to use these products and how to use them. Also, testing was being expanded on how they should be tested and evaluated. So all that was going on. And then in the use area, as I said earlier on, also the use was controlled by the consultant, the designer. And the designer had a lot of power in that once he specified a product, he could stick to that product or that type of product. And he would only accept that type of product. Now, some areas the industry found that good. Some areas the industry found that bad, because they found it difficult to get in. So all those sorts of things went on. But I think all those things were going on. And in the 1980s, there was still quite a lot of money being spent on the development of geosynthetics. So it was interesting for all those different areas. It had all the different areas, the manufacturing, the marketing, the technical, the development. All those areas were going on in the 1980s. Then when you got to the 1990s, things started to change and different emphasis on things like this, which made it kind of harder and more difficult in many ways, if you know what I mean. So I would say the 1980s were probably the most interesting in my experience. Yeah. And I'm that old I can remember what went on in the 1980s, you see.
No, that's great. That's great. No, thanks a lot, Chris, for your time. And yeah, like I said, I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure we will speak more in the near future. And hopefully we'll see you here in Brisbane next year for the conference.
Yeah, you'll definitely do that. And thank you very much for your time. And I'm very happy to have done this with you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot.